At that moment, Missy turned around and saw Chase. She hastily said goodbye to Seb and walked over to him, her eyes fixed on him. "Why are you here too?" Chase wasn't angry at all. He smiled at Missy. "I just came to see you." Missy was slightly stunned. "Is the office not busy?" Chase shook his head and was about to walk into the room. Missy was curious why it seemed like he wasn't unhappy at all. When Chase walked in, it was as if nothing had happened, and Missy started to wonder if he didn't care about her. She quickly chased after him and pulled his sleeve, asking, "Are you mad you saw me with Seb?" When Chase heard her words, he couldn't help but be slightly stunned. He lowered his head to look at the woman who was as tall as his shoulder. His lips curled into a smile. "Do you want me to be?" Missy lowered her head. She was just asking and hadn't expected Chase to get directly to her point. It made Missy's face turn red. "Seb and Kelly are going to get married soon, so why should I be jealous?" Missy was surprised when she heard Chase's words. She'd heard how things were going between Seb and Kelly, but what Chase said was completely different. She frowned. Weren't he and Kelly going to cancel their engagement in a year? Chase couldn't help but snort coldly. It seemed like Seb wasn't as harmless as he looked if he was still harboring those kinds of feelings toward Missy. Chase's expression darkened. Kelly's mother, Sheila, found out about their agreement. Missy was even more confused and disoriented. If that's the case, then it might be voided. However, only Missy, Seb, and Kelly knew about it. So how did Chase know? He didn't seem surprised or confused. Instead, his mind was clear. Missy asked directly, "How do you know?" Chase gave a slight grin. "Make a guess." Missy glared at him. "If you want me to guess, I'll guess." After that, she walked past Chase. Chase watched her go helplessly. Then he said, "I heard the conversation between Kelly and Sheila when I was passing by." When she heard his words, Missy couldn't help but sigh. She hadn't expected he'd find out that way, and it was such a coincidence that he'd passed by at the most crucial point. Although Missy sighed to herself, after entering the room, she didn't say anything. Instead, she just sat by the bed and looked at her father. At this moment, Missy's father was looking at them, and he said in a hoarse voice, "Missy." Missy looked up at her father. "Your injuries aren't healed yet. Don't move." Hearing that his daughter was concerned about him, Missy's father felt a little relieved. At least she hadn't abandoned him as her father. He lay in the bed and ate the fruit Missy gave him. Missy turned around to look at Chase and told him how she felt. Actually, Seb hasn't had it easy either. Missy couldn't help but sigh. When she saw Chase looking at her, she added faintly, "But in the end, this is the path he chose." Yes. When Chase heard Missy's words, he felt a little more at ease. We don't have to care about them anymore. We have to put ourselves first, understand? Yes. Missy nodded. She didn't want to listen to his speech. so it was better to nod and agree first. Chase seemed to know what Missy was thinking, and he couldn't help but smile. He sat down in a chair opposite her. Missy's father saw the interaction between the two of them and felt gratified in his heart. Missy walked over to Chase and asked in a low voice, "Are you tired?" Chase thought she was asking about work, so he nodded. "This is a busy time." The smile on Missy's face became brighter and brighter. Chase looked up and saw the smiling woman, and he couldn't help but frown and ask, "What happened to you?" "Nothing," Missy said. "But if you're tired, I will massage your shoulders." Chase was stunned. Missy smiled, and before he could react, she had already started to attack. The moment Missy put her hand on him, Chase relaxed, feeling comfortable, and the melancholy expression on his face dissipated. Missy's father raised his eyebrows slightly as he saw the scene. Before they arrived at the room, Seb pushed Kelly aside and widened the distance between them. They stared at each other angrily. If Kelly hadn't stopped him just now, he would have suffered. Perhaps he had already told her everything, but he didn't need to feel heartache because of Missy. Seb criticized Kelly. "Why are you so anxious to pull me away?" "I'm not. Didn't we come to see my mom? We've already wasted a lot of time, haven't we?" Kelly pointed at Sheila's room and pretended to be innocent. When Kelly saw Seb's expression, she knew that he hadn't let go of the things that happened in the past. Now that she had the opportunity to stand beside him, she wouldn't lose it. She had clearly fallen in love with him first. Why did Missy not do anything and still get the love of others? She wasn't worthy. Kelly was the woman who was worthy of Seb's deep love. Then you shouldn't have interrupted me and taken me away. You were the one who begged me to come over, so you should understand. Seb was burning with anger and couldn't care less about his image. The true love that he had once missed out on had reappeared, and now she was slipping through his grasp. All of that made Seb regret his past. If he had explained everything at the beginning, he wouldn't have felt such regret now. "You're here. Why didn't you come in?" Before Kelly could speak, a gentle voice came from behind them. Sheila stood at the door in a hospital gown, not noticing the mood between Kelly and Seb. She walked over and took her daughter's hand to bring her inside. Then she called Seb to come in as well. Facing Sheila, Seb restrained his temper. But Kelly was anxious as she kept looking back at him. There were a few times she wanted to call out to him but was held back by Sheila, who didn't let her speak. The mother and daughter chatted for a while in the room before Seb walked in. Although he was still in a bad mood, he didn't show it. "Mrs. Hurd, are you feeling better?" Kelly has been worrying." Sheila sighed and patted her daughter's hand with a face full of worry. "In the future, I need you to keep taking care of her and share some of the burden with me." "Mrs. Hurd, me and—" "Seb, don't stand there anymore. Come sit down. Kelly told me you've been busy with work recently and haven't had the time to rest, but you still came to see me." Sheila could tell what Seb was thinking with a glance and didn't give him the chance to speak. The two of them had been so loud that even a deaf person could hear them. She'd known that if she didn't go out to stop them, there could be trouble. It was Kelly's engagement that had sent her to the hospital. She'd found out that Kelly had bargained the marriage with Seb. It really made her heart break, but Sheila deliberately ignored that fact. Seb, tell me, you've been engaged to Kelly for so long, so shouldn't you go ahead and get things done? I'm an old woman, and I don't know how long I'll live. But I want to take care of my heart and give it to someone worthy of entrusting it to. After saying that, she intentionally glanced at him. When Sheila said that, Kelly's eyes instantly lit up, and her bad mood was swept away. She looked at Seb with anticipation, hoping that he would agree immediately. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hurd. I can't agree to that. Seb rejected Sheila's request without even thinking about it. He already had an agreement with Kelly regarding the marriage. Kelly looked at Seb in shock. She never thought he would be so merciless and directly reject her mother's proposal. Sheila, on the other hand, had a calm expression. She had expected Seb's answer, but she hadn't expected him to dare say it out loud. Our engagement is an agreement between the two of us, and I can't break it. I don't know what kind of agreement there was between the two of you, and I don't care. Kelly is a child and makes hasty promises, but as a mother, the only thing I care about is you and Kelly handling things. Sheila could guess all of Seb's words and did not want to give him the time to continue. Her gentle attitude fell away. Have you ever thought about your parents? Do you think they treat marriage as child's play? Facing Sheila's aggressive attitude, Seb didn't choose to give in. He had already missed out on many things in the past, and now he was left with regrets. He didn't want to regret anything else. Since the past couldn't be salvaged, he would try his best to make it up to her now. Mrs. Hurd, what you do is your decision, and I can't change it. Kelly may still be a child to you, but this agreement will not change because of your opinion. Although he'd agreed to marry Kelly, Seb never intended to stay with her. It had been a temporary measure, and he wasn't going to change his mind. Kelly was unable to bear Seb's resolute any longer. If what he said was true, and he broke their engagement, then all of her hard work would be in vain. She did not want that. Kelly stood up and ran to Seb's side. She pulled his arm and begged. Seb, you can't do this. I love you. Even if you don't do this for me, you can't refuse me for the sake of your company. I've done so much for you. You can't just abandon me like this. Seb pushed Kelly's tightly clenched hands away and took a step back, pulling away from her. He stared straight at her and felt a chill down his spine when he heard what she said. She actually said that what she'd done was for him? Don't you feel guilty? You said it was for me, but it was actually for yourself. What Kelly had done in the past not only hurt Missy, but also hurt other innocent people. But even now, she didn't feel that it was her fault. Instead, she blamed others for blocking her way. Kelly shook her head and denied Seb's assertions. Seb, I did not! She pretended that she didn't know what he was talking about. She had always done things secretly, So she didn't think that Seb would know anything. And even if he knew, as long as there was no evidence, she could deny everything and push the blame onto someone else. Kelly, do you think I don't know how many times you framed Missy? You know she can't swim, yet you deliberately pushed her into the water. If something happened, you would have killed her. You even plotted to make the CEO of El Sokol's wife eat the mango that Missy gave her, which gave her a serious allergic reaction. Do you think I didn't know? Seb carefully counted off the mistakes Kelly had made in the past and looked at her bitterly. He didn't understand how she could be so ruthless. Any of these things would be hard for an ordinary person to bring themselves to do, but she actually did all of it. Kelly stood still with a pale face. She didn't understand how he knew about those things. She had been careful and hadn't left any traces behind. Even if Missy knew about it, she couldn't produce any evidence to accuse her. I didn't! Do you still want to deny it? The message you sent to Missy on my phone is the best evidence. You deliberately used my phone to send fake messages to her and make her misunderstand me. If I hadn't found out, do you want me to go on? He could no longer tolerate her evil deeds. Perhaps the best thing to do now was to end the bad relationship between the two of them. Due to his habit of backing up his phone, he accidentally saw the message that he didn't send regarding Miss Soko's allergies. But perhaps the misunderstanding between him and Missy couldn't be resolved. This issue had already passed, and he didn't want to mention it again. But he understood that he couldn't let Kelly continue to mess around like this. It would only bring harm to them both. When Sheila heard what Seb was saying, she was shocked, and her heart ached. Her usually obedient and sensible daughter had actually done so many terrible things behind her back. None of those things could be salvaged. So the only thing she needed to do now was comfort Seb and save their relationship. Sheila sighed and said with an apologetic tone, Seb, it's all my fault. I didn't teach Kelly well, but everything she did was to get your attention. Forgive her just this once. Trust me, after you get married, Kelly will definitely be an obedient and doting wife and mother. Kelly kept nodding her head. As long as Seb agreed to the marriage, she would be willing to do anything. I'm sorry, but I can't. Our previous agreement was 1 year, but I don't think there's any need for me to wait a year. I'll hold a press conference to make an announcement. Seb had already made up his mind about the cancellation of the engagement. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. No! Sheila stood up from the hospital bed and walked over to the two of them. We agreed that it would be 1 year. The news of your engagement was just announced, so to suddenly announce its cancellation wouldn't be good for either of your reputations. You can wait until the time is up, right? Regardless of whether it was 1 year or half a year, Sheila felt that it was best to delay it. She didn't believe that 1 year couldn't change Seb's mind. 1 year's time was Sheila's biggest concession. Seb knew that he couldn't be too radical now. Otherwise, both sides would suffer. He could only agree for the time being and think of another way out. All right, it's a deal. I hope you'll hold up your end of the bargain. Seb deliberately looked at Kelly and said, I hope that no one but the three of us will know about this matter, including my parents. I will do what I have to do. Given Kelly's character, It was likely that she would do something that he didn't expect, so he had to prevent that from happening from the beginning. Facing Seb's firm attitude, Sheila could only agree. She had to get her daughter to come to her senses. Please get well soon, Mrs. Hurd. I have some matters to attend to, so I will be leaving. Seb nodded politely to show his respect to Sheila. Then, he left the hospital without even looking at Kelly. Kelly didn't even think and started to chase after him. But Sheila quickly pulled her back and stopped her. Chasing him now would be like slapping her own face, and her daughter could not be seen as a joke. When Seb disappeared at the door of the ward, Kelly shook off Sheila's hand and sat in the chair. She couldn't help but cry. Mom, why is everything I did wrong to him? Why can't he see how good I am? Sheila walked to her side and gently patted her back, sighing deeply. You silly child. Why wouldn't you talk to me? How could you do such a stupid thing? You are my daughter, so how could you not inherit anything from me? Anyone with discerning eyes could tell with just a glance that the reason Seb was able to endure until now was because of his tolerance towards Kelly. But she had made it so easy for him to accuse her. You either do things without leaving any trace behind, or you just have to behave yourself. In the end, everything gets found out. No matter how many good deeds you do, even if you repair your relationship with Missy, it won't be able to restore your position in Seb's heart. Sheila looked at Kelly in disappointment. I don't want to mend my relationship with that slut Missy. If it weren't for her constantly appearing around Seb, she and Seb might have already been married. Sheila knew what her daughter was thinking. Seb had always cared about Missy. Her daughter had put in so much effort, but the result was still the same. Kelly, there are men all over the world. Just let go of this one. I don't want to. I want Seb. I've liked him since college. It's been so many years. I can't let go of him, Mom. Kelly cried even harder when she thought of the sadness she had felt all these years. She had waited and persisted for so many years. She couldn't let go, nor could she just give up. Sheila had no choice but to bend to her daughter's wishes. However, she could only change her daughter's attitude towards Seb. She couldn't blindly try to get rid of the obstacles around him. Instead, she would take care of him and slowly trap him in her heart. The hospital corridor was a little dark, and Chase's face looked gloomy in the darkness. He only picked up Jeremy's call when he reached a remote corner.
Is there a result?
The man's hoarse voice was clear in the silent hospital. He was referring to Missy's real identity. After the discrepancy between Missy and her father's blood type, Chase suspected her identity and sent Jeremy to investigate. Yes, sir. Mrs. Luther is indeed not the biological daughter of the Danvers family. She was raised by the Danvers family. However, I haven't been able to find out her true identity. It's as if someone is deliberately stopping me from investigating. Jeremy's voice was filled with doubt. He had used Luther Inc.'s intelligence network and some underground connections, but there were no clues about Missy's background. How complicated was it? A dark light flashed in Chase's eyes. He was silent for a long time before he said in a deep voice, "There is no need to investigate further." Since even Jeremy couldn't find anything out, it could only mean that Missy's background was not simple. But no matter what her identity was, Chase didn't care. She was his wife, and that was enough. Chase turned around and returned to the room. Missy was currently sitting in the room peeling an apple. Sunlight shot in through the window and landed on her face, covering her entire body in light. Time seemed to have stopped. Chase stood at the door and looked at Missy's entire body in light. Time seemed to have stopped. Chase stood at the door and looked at Missy's profile with a faint smile. As long as she was by his side, everything was worth it, Chase thought to himself. This kind of ordinary life had always been what he yearned for. He looked at Missy in a daze, seeing nothing but her. "You're back!" Missy had long noticed someone staring at her. They looked at each other and smiled, filled with happiness and sweetness. Chase's tough facial features softened a little. He nodded, walked to Missy's side, and sat down. "Here you go." Missy handed the peeled apple to Chase. He took it without hesitation and took a big bite. "The apple is delicious." It wasn't the apple itself that was delicious. The apple was peeled by someone he liked, so it was delicious. Even though the two of them had been together for some time, every time this man looked at her, it made Missy feel overwhelmed with emotion, and her face would heat up. She lowered her head shyly and stammered, "You talk too much." In front of the person she loved, even Missy, the strong woman, had become someone who needed to be protected. Chase laughed involuntarily. He looked at Missy with more and more love and wanted to embrace her. Missy's father witnessed the interaction between the two of them, and he couldn't help but reveal a gratified smile. He knew that Missy had suffered a lot in their family, but now she finally had a happy life. That made him feel better. Time passed by in a flash. In the blink of an eye, 2 weeks had passed, and Missy's father's injuries had almost fully healed. Missy was busy at work when suddenly an unfamiliar phone call came in. A sweet voice came from the other end of the phone. "Hello? May I ask if this is Miss Danvers?" Missy nodded her head and was somewhat puzzled. "Who are you?" "I am a nurse from the hospital. Your father will be discharged today. Please come and fill out some paperwork." "Okay, I'll be there in a moment." After hanging up the phone, Missy frowned and thought about it. Her father had been in the hospital for more than half a month. Now it seemed that his injuries had recovered. She sighed helplessly. No matter what Missy's parents had done to her, Missy would never forget the kindness of their nurturing. However, it was limited to this. She didn't owe them anything, and now, it was time to end this. After packing up things on her desk, Missy went to Chase's office. "I'm going to the hospital." Chase frowned in confusion, and then he heard Missy add, "He was discharged today." Although she didn't say his name, Chase could tell what Missy meant. He put down his work and said with concern, "I will go with you." The two of them went downstairs, and Chase drove Missy to the hospital. In the hospital, Missy's father didn't have many things, so Missy went to help him pack up. He had recovered well, and he could already get out of bed and walk. His injuries had mostly disappeared. Missy packed his things and said, "Wait here for a while. I'll go to the desk to pay." After coming out of the room, Missy only took a few steps before she felt that someone was following her. She turned and saw Chase. He said, "Let's go together." He had nothing to say to Missy's father. Now that he knew that Missy was not related to him by blood, he disliked the Danvers family even more. The two of them went to the desk, where the young nurse saw them and smiled warmly. "Miss Danvers, you're here." Missy nodded and asked, "How much is it in total?" The young nurse calculated the bill. Missy took her wallet from her bag, but suddenly, a long arm passed over her. Chase's low and pleasant voice entered her ears. "I'll pay." "No need." Missy was helpless. This was Missy's father's expense, and she didn't want Chase to cover it. Before Missy could stop her, the nurse had already finished charging the card and handed it back to Chase. She teased with envy. "Miss Danvers, you and your husband's relationship is really good." Missy smiled but didn't say anything.
It would be better if you called her Mrs. Luther,
Chase said. The nurse smiled and called her that, and Missy felt embarrassed when she heard it. At that time, Missy's mother rushed in anxiously. The moment she entered, she saw Missy and Chase standing in front of the desk. She rushed over, grabbed Missy's arm, and asked anxiously, "Did they pay? Why haven't I heard about compensation?" There were already many people in the lobby, and they were in front of the main desk. As soon as Missy's mother spoke, countless eyes looked over. The young nurse frowned and softly reminded her, "Please be quiet." Missy's mother didn't care and shook Missy's arm. "You have to get that money for me. You can't let your father stay in the hospital for nothing. There are medical fees and inpatient fees." Missy was speechless. Countless gazes were on her and her mother was being an embarrassment. Chase gave her a deep look, took out a bank card, and handed it to Missy's mother. He said in a deep voice, "There is $1 million here." After a pause, Chase added, "The compensation money." When Missy's mother received the money, she was so happy that she didn't know what to do. She nodded repeatedly and kept saying, "My son-in-law is so sensible." Seeing that, Missy's expression was ugly. That money must have been from Chase himself. There wasn't enough time for any compensation to have been awarded yet. Missy watched her mother in irritation. Even her words were somewhat impatient. Money, money, money. She was just greedy. "All right, let's go to the room and take the things out." Missy's mother was in a good mood because of the money, and Chase was there, so she didn't argue. They walked toward the room. Missy's father had been waiting for them, and when he saw them, he immediately went up and asked, "It's all done, right?" "I'll send you guys home," Missy said lightly. After removing her father's things, Missy took her family to the curb. She waved her hand and called a taxi. Then she went to put her father's luggage in the car's trunk. Missy's mother curled her lips and whispered, "I want to ride in a luxury car." Her voice was neither loud nor soft, and Missy heard her, but she ignored her comment. They had already troubled Chase quite a lot, and she didn't want to have anything to do with the Danvers family anymore. Chase didn't need to give them a ride. She would just let everything that happened earlier pass. All these years, they had never seemed to love her. So when she found out that she wasn't their daughter, Missy accepted her identity calmly. Missy's father pulled his wife to the side and scolded her in a low voice. "Don't say anything else." Chase was still there, making things awkward. and Missy still had work to do. Missy's mother turned her head away unhappily, as if she was blaming her husband for meddling in her business. "Missy, sorry to trouble you." Missy's father smiled awkwardly and pulled her mother toward the car. "Let's hurry up and leave. We shouldn't keep them from work." Seeing that the two of them were about to leave, Missy shouted out of the blue, "Wait a moment." "What is it?" Missy's father and mother looked at her in confusion. She took a deep breath and said, "Thank you for raising me, but I can't take care of you. Try not to contact me in the future." Missy's parents had cared for her for more than 20 years, but she felt she didn't owe them anything. Moreover, they had gotten so much money from her, so they could treat it as their compensation. Once they parted ways, the matters of the Danvers family would no longer concern her. When she heard Missy's somewhat sad words, Missy's mother was stunned. She frowned and was about to scold her. What did Missy mean by that? But before she could say anything, the taxi driver called out impatiently, "Are you guys still going?" We're leaving now." Missy's father didn't think much about it and pulled Missy's mother into the car. Missy watched the taxi disappear and felt a little lost. Her connection with the Danvers family was getting further and further away. Over 20 years of life made Missy feel like she was in a dream. Chase watched her quietly and didn't say anything. He knew Missy must have been feeling uncomfortable at that moment. After all, 20 years wasn't something that could be let go just like that. And the Danvers family hadn't been good to her all those years. However, it was because of these experiences that the two of them met. When Missy could no longer see the taxi, she turned back to Chase and said, "Let's go." Missy was annoyed, and after getting into the car, she turned to look at the street outside the window. The two sides of the street kept moving backward, and the surrounding area looked familiar. Missy was stunned and suddenly turned to look at Chase. "Are you going to Grandpa's house?" Chase smiled and nodded. He felt that Missy needed to relax a little, and his grandfather's house was a good place to do it. When the two of them got out of the car, the housekeeper welcomed them. "Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Luther, you're free today." "We came to see Senior Mr. Luther," Missy said as she held Chase's arm and walked into the house. Senior Mr. Luther was sitting at his table and playing chess bored. When he saw Chase, he patted his leg and stood up. He looked like an elderly kid with his beard blowing and his eyes wide open. "You two finally remembered this old man." Chase and Missy looked at each other and smiled helplessly. Missy went forward and helped him sit down. "Grandpa, what are you talking about? We've been thinking about you all the time." When he heard Missy's words, the elder Luther instantly smiled. He looked at Missy and nodded repeatedly. The more he saw of her, the more satisfied he was. "Missy is a sweet talker, unlike someone." As Senior Mr. Luther spoke, he glared at Chase, implying something. Missy was amused and her depressed mood was gone. She always smiled around Chase's grandfather. Every time she visited him, she felt all her fatigue disappear. Chase remained silent and sat opposite them. When he saw Missy's mood had improved, the corner of his mouth curled up. It was a good decision to bring her here today. After chatting for a while, Mr. Luther was a little tired, and Missy quickly said, "Grandpa, why don't you go and rest? We can entertain ourselves." The elder Luther looked back and forth between the two of them. Finally, he yawned and said, "I'm old. I just wake up and fall asleep again. I'll go and take a nap, but you two don't need to leave." He was worried that they would be gone when he woke up. Missy said with a smile, "We won't leave. We still have to eat lunch with you, right, Chase?" Chase met her eyes and nodded. Only then did Mr. Luther relax and go to rest. "Let's go to the pond," Missy said to Chase. They took some fish food from the house, and Missy ran to the pond outside to feed the fish, excited to see the colorful goldfish swimming happily in the pond. After feeding the goldfish for a while, Missy suddenly stopped smiling and looked at Chase seriously. "Thank you." She knew that Chase brought her here to cheer her up, and she was grateful to him. Chase was stunned for a moment, then looked at her tenderly.
You don't have to thank me.
After the three of them finished their meal, Missy stood up to help clean up, but the elder Luther pulled her to the living room. He pointed at the chessboard that had been set up and motioned for her to sit down. "You can't run away today. No one else can play with me." As he spoke, the elder Luther let go of her hand and sat beside the chessboard. He started to set up the chess pieces. "If you win today, there'll be a prize, so you have to work hard." It had been a long time since the two of them played chess, and that time, Missy hadn't played well and lost to Mr. Luther. Since then, Missy had been playing online so she could use today to see how much she had improved. Mr. Luther started off strong. At the beginning, he captured one of Missy's pieces, causing her to lose the opportunity to attack. For the time being, she could only focus on defense. Following that, she made use of a mistake the elder Luther made and found a slight advantage. Mr. Luther praised her. "You've improved a lot." She had not only stolen his piece, but also blocked his path. It seemed that she had secretly learned a lot since the last time they played. However, those little tricks weren't enough to scare the elder. After a little reorganization, he took back the advantage that Missy had just created. There weren't many chess pieces left on the board, and Missy didn't dare to make a move. She was afraid that she would take another wrong step and get caught in the trap that the elder had set for her. He could tell that Missy was racking her brain to think of a way to solve the problem. But with the current situation of the game, if he didn't give her some encouragement, Missy would be defeated. "Are you unable to think of a way to get out of my trap?" Missy looked at the game and nodded honestly. She thought that since she had learned so much, she should have been able to win. And even if she didn't, she should have been able to see through the tricks. However, the outcome was different. Even though she had a small advantage, compared to the elder Luther, she was still weaker. "How about this? This time, I will allow you to use an external helper." The elder Luther straightened and placed the chess piece in his hand into the box. He looked at Chase, who wasn't far behind Missy. Missy turned and saw Chase standing in the sunlight, fiddling with the flowers and plants. She asked in confusion, "Does Chase know how to play chess?" The two of them had known each other for so long, but she'd never heard him talk about it. And his grandfather had never asked him to play, which made her wonder whether his chess skills were worse than hers. The elder Luther looked at her with a smile. "You won't know if you don't ask." Seeing that she was about to lose the game, Missy could only gamble. She dragged Chase over, pointed at the game that she was about to lose, and begged, "Will you help me?" Chase glanced around and immediately understood his grandfather's intention. He moved a piece and turned the situation around. Missy was amazed. She had been unable to figure it out, but Chase had changed the situation in seconds. The grandfather and grandson went back and forth, neither giving in to each other, and Missy didn't dare blink. She had never thought that Chase's chess skills would be so good. He was on par with his grandfather. If she had known earlier, she would have learned from him, and maybe she wouldn't have been beaten from the beginning. When the last piece was placed, the game was already set, and the winner was decided. Senior Mr. Luther looked at his lost game and couldn't help but sigh. "I didn't expect that you would still be so unforgiving even after not playing chess for so long."
You still play the same, grandfather. You set traps everywhere.
After saying that, Chase put the scattered pieces on the chessboard back into the box. When the game ended, Missy wasn't satisfied. She hadn't known Chase was so good. With just a few moves, he had reversed the situation and won. It was beyond her expectations. No matter what, Missy won. Vittorio, can you bring me the thing upstairs? The elder Luther called his butler, Vittorio, and asked him to get what he promised to give Missy. Vittorio stood there in surprise and said, Mr. Luther, you're going to... The elder Luther looked at him unhappily. Hurry up and get it for me. Vittorio knew that the elder had made up his mind to give the gift to Missy, and he didn't want to say anything anymore. He brought the gift downstairs and handed it to Mr. Luther. Missy, this is for you. He put a red box in Missy's hand. Missy gently opened the aged red box and saw that it was placed inside. It was an old-fashioned jade bracelet. It was transparent and crystal clear, and the color was pure. Although it was a bit old, it was clear that it was a quality gemstone. Grandpa, I can't accept such a precious thing. Missy carefully closed the box and placed it in front of the elder Luther. The elder Luther didn't say anything. He took the bracelet from the box and put it on Missy's hand. What do you think? Missy felt uneasy and wanted to take the bracelet off, but Mr. Luther stopped her and said, This is a family heirloom. Chase's grandmother wanted to leave it to her daughter-in-law, and she had Chase's mother. Now it's your turn, so don't reject it. It's a gift from us. The elder Luther sighed deeply and looked at Chase with a pained look. Missy noticed that Chase's head was lowered, and his expression was sad. The jade bracelet was for the daughter-in-law of the Luther family, and Chase's mother had passed away. It had been returned to Mr. Luther, and now it was given to Missy and acknowledged her as a member of the family. Mr. Luther knew that Chase's mother's death had always been a thorn in his heart. Today, he gave the bracelet to Missy, hoping that she would be there for all of them, so that Chase could slowly release his suffering. You two have been married for a while. Chase, find a time to take Missy to see your mother's grave and let her know that you found a good wife. Chase didn't say anything, but looked at the jade bracelet on Missy's wrist blankly. Some things left an indelible scar. Even if he turned a blind eye, it still existed. The elder Luther knew that Chase had something on his mind, so he let it go for the time being. There were many things that he didn't want to force. Perhaps one day, he would think it through by himself. That would be for the best. Missy saw the troubled look on Chase's face and knew that the scar in his heart hadn't healed yet. Thinking of that, she couldn't help but sigh, but she didn't ask him about it. Don't worry, I won't ask you anymore, Missy said, but Chase didn't seem to be in high spirits. Missy's eyes dimmed. I get it. I don't even know who my biological parents are. The elder Luther heard Missy say that, and his expression changed. Even if you don't know your biological parents, it doesn't matter. You can treat this place as your own home. Grandpa? Missy looked at Mr. Luther in surprise. Her eyes filled with tears. How did he know about that? I already heard about it from Chase, Mr. Luther said. So don't worry, you're our family. Grandpa, Missy felt warm from head to toe. She'd been worried that Chase's family would hate her after finding out her identity, but instead, the elder Luther was so nice to her.
Grandpa, Missy, you two talk. I'm going out for a while.
After saying that, Chase left. Missy frowned. She wanted to stop him, but was stopped by Mr. Luther. She looked at Mr. Luther in confusion. "Grandpa?" The elder Luther said, "Don't worry about him. Let him be alone for a while." He asked Missy to follow him, so she did. Not knowing why, when they reached their destination, she was stunned. "Do you want to write?" Mr. Luther smiled. "You have sharp eyes. I knew you were no ordinary person." Missy blushed. "What are you writing?" Mr. Luther gave a beautiful smile. "Take a look." His hand flew across the paper, and Missy recognized a poem forming. However, Missy frowned. Looking at the black words in front of her, she couldn't help but think of Chase. Since he was gone, she was distracted. Seeing that she was no longer in the mood to watch him draw, Mr. Luther stopped what he was doing. "Are you thinking about Chase?" It's not a bad thing for you to think about him. As a grandfather, I'm happy you're so concerned about him. Chase has been like that since he was young. But if you're worried, you can go look for him. He might be in the attic." Missy was slightly stunned. But the elder Luther waved his hand and said, "Go ahead, I'll just be writing here." Seeing Mr. Luther seemed fine by himself, Missy left. The elder Luther watched her go, shaking his head helplessly. As Missy stepped into the small attic, she heard the sound of music, so she stopped and listened. Standing at the door, Missy was immersed in the sound of the violin. This place was Kate Luther's violin room when she was still alive. The violin played by Chase was extremely sad. She was trapped in the sound of the violin. Sound of the violin. And there was no way for her to escape. Looking at Chase's back, Missy couldn't help but feel that Chase's heart was quite bitter. At that moment, Missy couldn't help feeling heartache for him. The sound of the violin stopped abruptly, and Missy came back to her senses. She started to walk inside, but a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Luther." It was Vittorio. He said, "Mrs. Luther, this is Mr. Luther's private place. No one else is allowed to enter." Missy knew that Vittorio had been with the Luther family for a long time, and she knew Chase's temper. So she stopped in her tracks and said to Vittorio, "All right, I understand." Vittorio heaved a sigh of relief, nodded his head and left. Missy took a final look inside the room. When she saw the sorrowful look on Chase's face, Missy's heart went out to him. But in the end, she went back downstairs. When she got downstairs, she saw that Mr. Luther was still writing. So she walked over slowly and tried not to disturb him. However, he still noticed and asked, "Didn't you go to see Chase?" Missy spoke directly. "Grandpa, can you tell me about Chase's mother?" When Mr. Luther heard what Missy said, he couldn't help but frown. "What's wrong? Why do you want to learn about her?" "I just can't bear to see him like this," Missy answered. The elder Luther took a deep breath and looked at the attic profoundly. He called Missy to sit beside him and said slowly, "It's been a long time, and Chase never wants to talk about it. Over time, I stopped wanting him to talk about his sadness." Chase's mother, Kate, was the daughter of the Harrison family, renowned at Juilliard in New York. In beauty and talent, she was one of a kind. Everyone said that it was the fortune of the Harrison family to have such an enviable daughter, and they all wanted their sons to marry her. However, that beautiful woman was angered to death by Chase's father, Jesse. Jesse fell in love with Kate at first sight and soon won her over. The two of them were like glue, and Jesse quickly proposed. Kate, who was in love, agreed without thinking. However, the Harrison family didn't agree because they'd hoped that their daughter's future husband would be from another prestigious musical family, not just someone with money. But Kate loved Jesse deeply and didn't listen to her parents' advice, stubbornly marrying him. However, Jesse Luther was not a principled man. Not long after Kate gave birth to a child, he started flirting with other women. No matter how Kate tried to persuade him, he wouldn't spend any time at home. Over time, she became depressed. For 3 years, she had to take care of her young son and think of a way to win back her beloved husband. In the end, illness came knocking at her door and became the straw that broke the camel's back. Kate was in the hospital for 3 years, but she lost her struggle with illness and left the world with regret, leaving her young son behind. Missy hadn't expected Chase's family to have such a tragic past. It was no wonder that he held a grudge against his father. For as long as he could remember, he had watched his parents not getting along. His father hooked up with many people, and his mother was depressed. That was why he had such a depressing personality. When she thought of Chase's lonely appearance in the attic, Missy's heart ached, and she sighed at the injustice of fate. The Harrison family had never agreed to the marriage, and that was why Kate was unable to receive any support from anyone. That was why she died alone and full of regret and anger in the hospital. Mr. Luther also blamed himself for that incident. Not only had he not taught his son well, but he had also failed to take care of his daughter-in-law. As a result, Chase lost his mother when he was young. Kate's death didn't bring Jesse back. He abandoned his young child and continued to live happily like a single man. The elder Luther felt pity for his daughter-in-law passing. It was a pity that his grandson didn't have parents who loved him. So he took him in and raised him. He could only turn a blind eye to his disappointing son. Even though the elder Luther had given all his love to Chase, Kate's death left an indelible memory in his mind. 20 years had passed, and the thorn had pierced into his bone and blood and couldn't be pulled out. Mr. Luther patted Missy's hand. With a sad face, he said, "Missy, I know I'm old and I won't be able to stay with him for long. Now that he has you by his side, you must take good care of him for me. Stay with him so he can let go of the past." He could see the changes between Missy and Chase, and he believed his judgments about Missy were right. However, he wasn't sure how Missy could change Chase. His only hope was that Missy could open Chase's heart and make him happy. Missy nodded. I will definitely stay with him." Even if the elder Luther hadn't told her these things, Missy would still have chosen to do it. She was raised by Mr. and Mrs. Danvers, but they were not her biological parents. Although she didn't know whether her biological parents were alive or dead, Missy understood the pain of losing parents. The grandfather and granddaughter-in-law chatted downstairs for a long time. Chase, who had been in the attic, suddenly opened the door and walked out. Missy immediately stood up. Chase seemed the same as usual, but Missy could vaguely see the reluctance in his eyes. She stepped forward and wanted to hold his arm. But Chase walked over to his grandfather and said softly, "It's late. Missy and I need to go home." Missy looked at her empty hand and felt a little disappointed. But she remembered what Mr. Luther had just told her and could understand Chase's actions. They left Mr. Luther and drove home. When they'd arrived, Chase had been talking and laughing with her, but now he was obviously preoccupied with something. And the two of them didn't talk on the drive. When they returned home, Missy asked Chase if there was anything he wanted to eat for dinner. Chase seemed disinterested and went to his study. Missy saw through the crack of the door that Chase was holding a picture in his hand and rubbed his finger repeatedly on it. Missy knew that it must have been a picture of Kate. Although she didn't know what her late mother-in-law looked like, she could feel that Chase loved his mother a lot. That was why he couldn't let go of her. At Chase's grandfather's house, the elder Luther had mentioned that Chase sometimes looked similar to his mother. Missy figured that if Kate was still alive, she would definitely be a graceful and noble woman. Before she went to bed, Missy took a bath. When she came out, Chase was sitting on the bed with a book in his hand. Under the warm yellow light, he looked like a scholar. Missy dried her hair and sat beside him. She took the book from his hand and put it aside, said, "I want to go back to my old house tomorrow." "All right." Chase nodded and didn't ask her what she was going to do. Missy knew that he wasn't in high spirits. She leaned over, wrapped her arms around his waist, gently placed her head on his chest, and softly said, "I want to go and get my things." "I know. I'll send you over tomorrow," Chase said with an indifferent tone. That made Missy a little depressed. She'd been trying to divert his attention, but the result was not what she wanted. She raised her head, and her warm breath brushed against Chase's neck. Let the past be the past. You can't give those things back. But you still have me. We have a long future together, and I will always be with you. Chase lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers. Their eyes met, and Missy's heart beat rapidly. Without thinking, she kissed him. The warmth on his lips made Chase realize that this was the first time Missy had taken the initiative. As Missy was about to pull away with a red face, he suddenly pulled Missy's head closer, not giving her the chance to retreat. With the kiss closed, Missy lay in Chase's arms. Her face was red, and she punched him bashfully. If it weren't for the fact that he couldn't breathe, Chase wouldn't have let go of her. Because of Missy's initiative, Chase was in a much better mood. After turning off the light, he hugged Missy tightly in his arms. Their bodies were so close that there was no gap between them. Missy was nervous and struggled a bit to no avail, so she chose to give up and stay peacefully in his arms. The next morning, the glaring sunlight shone into the room, waking Chase up. When he opened his eyes, he found that the bed beside him was empty, and the curtains were pulled open. It was obvious Missy had done it on purpose. Chase smiled and got off the bed to wash up. When he came to the living room, he had already smelled the fragrance of breakfast, but he did not see Missy. He looked around and found her playing with the cat near the balcony. Yesterday, because Chase was in a bad mood, Missy had been completely focused on him and neglected Toffee, which made the little orange cat angry. He was indifferent to the cat food that Missy had brought over, and no matter how Missy coaxed him, he just stayed in the cat bed and didn't come out. When Missy was preparing breakfast, she noticed that the food she'd given him yesterday was all kicked to the ground, so she cleaned it up. Hearing the footsteps, Missy turned around and saw Chase walking toward her. She stood up but accidentally bumped into the cat tower and knocked into it with some pain. Chase ran over and asked if she was hurt. Missy shook her head. "I'm fine. It just hurts a little. But Toffee won't eat, and I'm worried he'll get sick." Hearing Chase's voice, Toffee also raised his head, and his eyes met Chase's questioning gaze. He jumped up and ran into Missy's arm with a discontented meow. The man and the cat had a grudge, and yesterday, Missy didn't pay attention to him because of Chase. Toffee felt uncomfortable, and when he saw Chase come over to snatch Missy from him, he couldn't help but react. Missy caught the cat, but ended up scattering the cat food she was holding, and some of it accidentally smashed into Chase's face. Chase subconsciously closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he glowered at the cat. Missy petted the cat and said helplessly, "He's just a cat. Why are you angry with him? I'm having a hard enough time getting him to eat." Chase's self-esteem deflated. He couldn't even compare to a cat. To make himself feel better, he grabbed Missy's chin and kissed her. The cat jumped out of her arms and started to enjoy breakfast. Missy was tormented by the humans' and cats' childish actions. She really didn't know what to do. After breakfast, Missy and Chase drove to the neighborhood where Missy's parents lived. Missy wanted Chase to stay in the car so she could settle things herself. Chase sat in the driver's seat and held her hand.
Yesterday you were there for me, and you want me to let you go by yourself?
Missy knew that he didn't want her to face her parents alone, so she agreed to let him come with her. The moment the doorbell rang, Missy's mother stood up from the sofa and walked toward the door. When she saw Missy through the peephole, she immediately opened the door and scolded, "You wretched girl! Can't you stop torturing me? I just want to rest for a few days. Don't you know how tired I am from taking care of your father in the hospital? Once she noticed Chase behind Missy with an ugly expression on his face, Missy's mother immediately changed her attitude. "Oh, it's Mr. Luther. Come in, come in." Chase snorted coldly and walked into the house with Missy. He had heard everything she'd said. It seemed that when he wasn't around, Missy's mother bullied her. Missy was the one who'd done all the work at the hospital. Her mother was never there, but now she was taking the credit? It was almost impressive. "Missy, why are you and Mr. Luther here? Did you happen to get more compensation money?" Facing Chase, Missy's mother was painfully polite. "No, I came to collect the rest of my things. After all, I am married, right?" Hearing that Missy was going to take all her things, Missy's mother was quite happy. She wouldn't have to see her here again. On the surface, she tried to look reluctant, but her eyes revealed that she wanted Missy to leave quickly. Missy didn't pay attention to her mother and walked straight into her room with Chase following her. This room was more of a closet than a bedroom, with only one window letting in light from outside. There was a single bed leaning against the wall, only a step away from the door. If it was any bigger, the door wouldn't have been able to close. There was a small table at the head of the bed, and there were some books and a few frames placed on it. Missy's old cabinet creaked when it opened as if it would collapse at any time. There were a few boxes at the bottom of the bed that contained some of Missy's collections. These were the only things she had left behind when she got married. There was also an old poster on the wall with the corner slightly rolled up. The person on it was an actor that Missy liked when she was in middle school. Because Missy's mother hadn't let her spend money randomly, this poster was a gift from a friend. The entire room was so small it could fit in one of the Luthers' bathrooms, but it was an indispensable part of Missy's past life and contained all of her memories since she was young. Today, Missy had come to say goodbye. There weren't many things Missy wanted to take with her from this room. Most of them were memories of the past, and would only remind her that she had never been a part of this family. She took out the photo album that she had kept in the closet and flipped through a few pages. After finding some photos, she put them on the table and caressed them a few times before turning away. Chase hugged her from behind and opened the photo album on the table. He asked,
Why don't you take it with you?
Missy lowered her head and looked at the photos with a lonely expression. Why should I? It can't change the fact that I'm not a part of this family. The entire album recorded her life since she was young. She only had a few photos of herself and her brother, and none of just herself. Since she was young, she'd known that her parents treated her differently from her brother. No matter what kind of photos they took, Greg would always stand in between Missy's father and mother, while she would stand by the side. She had once wondered why she was the only one standing by the side, despite being a part of the family. But over time, she had gotten used to it. Chase closed the album and hugged her tightly.
Are you sad?
Missy shook her head. Maybe when I was young, but it's disappeared. When Greg started to talk, he was always thinking of me. It made up for the lack of care that my parents had for me. Greg had been sensible since he was young, and he was always the first to notice things that Missy's parents would not notice. Although he was a spoiled child at home, he didn't develop an arrogant personality. On the contrary, when he saw Missy being wronged, he took sides with her. Although Missy wished her parents had loved her, she wasn't jealous because she felt that Greg was the little angel that the heavens gave to her, and she had always been warm to him. Although she was not a part of this family, she wouldn't lose her love for Greg. He was her younger brother, and that would never change. At that moment, Chase was grateful for Greg's existence. He had been a warm light in Missy's lonely childhood. Chase didn't stop her from leaving anything behind. After packing a few things up, they left the room. Missy's mother, who had been waiting in the living room, heard the sound and hurriedly went up to them. When she saw the things in their hands, she wanted to take them, but Missy refused. Missy, you haven't been home for a while, so why don't you stay for a meal? What do you want to eat? Ask your father to buy it. Yeah, I remember you like ribs a lot. I'll go get some. Missy's father echoed. Missy rejected her parents' invitation. This might have been the kind of family she had hoped for, but when she'd needed it, they weren't even willing to pretend. Now, in order to show off in front of Chase, they deliberately pretended to be caring, which made Missy uncomfortable. No need. I still have things to do. Take care of yourselves. Facing Missy's inexplicable actions, Missy's parents were at a loss. They stood there and looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Missy and Chase left the Danvers family and went out to the car. In the warm sunlight, Missy let out a long breath. After putting everything in the trunk of the car, She finally felt a sense of relief. After they got into the car, Missy realized that it was still early and wanted to go to work. However, Chase refused.
Let's put work aside for now. You must remember that you are my wife first, Mrs. Luther, and then a secretary at Luther Inc.
After saying that, he kissed Missy's forehead.
Today, the boss decided not to go to work, so you should accompany me.
As he spoke, Chase started the car. Missy knew that Chase didn't want her to throw herself into her work with a heavy heart. That would only make her feel worse and lower her efficiency. Not long after they got home, Chase mysteriously asked Missy to wait for him at the door. After a while, Missy heard a loud engine sound. Chase appeared in front of her on a Harley with a helmet on his head and another in his hand. He handed her the other helmet and said,
"Get on."
Missy looked at him in confusion but still put on the helmet. She sat behind him and held his waist tightly. The sound of the engine started again, and the two of them flew away like a bullet. There was a sudden weightlessness that made Missy feel like she was flying. Through the helmet, Missy watched the rapidly retreating scenery. It made her feel like she was flying away from the past. It was disappearing and being replaced by other things. When the Harley stopped, Missy was still in a trance. It wasn't until Chase took off his helmet and knocked on it that she realized that they had reached their destination. The moment she got off the motorcycle and took off her helmet, Missy was mesmerized by the scenery. Where are we?
The suburbs.
Chase put their helmets on the motorcycle, held her hand and walked in. Missy hadn't known there to be such a beautiful place in Jacksonville. It was already autumn, and there were fallen leaves on the streets every day. But here, not only were there green trees everywhere, but there were also all kinds of flowers in the flower beds, competing with each other for beauty. Orchids, mountain tea, and chrysanthemums bloomed beautifully. How did you find this place? Missy got closer to an orchid. The enchanting fragrance seeped into her nostrils, improving her mood in an instant. Chase didn't answer her but squeezed her hand and pulled her into his embrace. He gently kissed her and went to pluck a flower for her. But Missy stopped him. "It's beautiful there. Don't spoil it." Chase found her tender and loving heart cute. He listened to her suggestion and withdrew his hand, allowing the flower to continue growing peacefully. At that moment, a figure emerged from a small courtyard house. Chase looked at the man and couldn't help but smile. Missy couldn't help but be slightly stunned. She had never seen Chase smile so happily before.
"Uncle Edwin, how are you?"
When he heard Chase call him, Edwin immediately walked forward.
"Why haven't I seen you for a long time?"
When he saw Missy, he was surprised and asked,
This is my wife, Missy."
Chase smiled as he turned to Missy.
"This is Uncle Edwin. He was once our landscaper, but he left."
Missy could tell that Chase didn't want to discuss that part of the story in front of him, so she left it alone. Chase pulled her over to Edwin.
"Uncle Edwin, since we're here, why don't you invite us in?"
The man shook his head.
"Look at my memory. I'm being impolite. Come with me. Nothing has changed."
His mouth curved into a beautiful smile. Edwin welcomed the two of them into the house. As they walked in, Missy saw flowers and plants all over the place. "What is this man's story?" she asked. Chase saw that Edwin was far ahead, so he answered.
"Uncle Edwin was our landscaper, and he's excellent at his job. But there were some unforeseen events. That's why.
Missy couldn't help but frown when she heard what Chase said. She knew that there had to be a story, and although Chase had told her, there were many things that he hadn't clearly explained. Edwin brought in some tea and snacks and said,
"Let me know if you need more to eat."
Missy smiled politely and said, "Uncle Edwin, the flowers and plants here are really beautiful." Hearing Missy's praise, Edwin beamed. Since Chase brought Missy here, it was obvious he liked her a lot.
"If you like them, you can take some with you."
He thought that after she heard that, she would immediately go and pick some flowers. However, Missy hesitated. "What do you mean? The flowers here are so beautiful. If they were plucked, they would only die." As he listened to Missy, Edwin understood why Chase had chosen her to be his wife. His smile grew wider. It was a foolish suggestion. Hearing Edwin say that, Missy couldn't help but look at Chase in embarrassment, feeling like she'd said something wrong. But then Edwin said,
"Mr. Luther, you found a great woman."
Chase smiled and agreed.
"Of course she is."
Missy blushed, not expecting the praise. Edwin looked at the two people in front of him and his eyes became moist. It had been so many years since Mrs. Luther had died. Mr. Luther had grown up and even married, and his wife was so similar to his mother. Thinking of that, tears flowed down Edwin's face. Missy looked at him in panic. "Uncle Edwin, are you all right?"
I'm fine. I'm just too excited."
Edwin answered. Missy looked at Chase helplessly and asked him to comfort the old man. Chase got the hint and couldn't help but smile. He looked at Edwin and said,
"Uncle Edwin, the weather is perfect, and there are hundreds of flowers outside. Why don't we go see them?"
When Edwin heard Chase's words, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. There were hundreds of flowers outside. It was almost winter, so how many flowers could there be? But since Chase was trying to comfort him, he had to respond. He stood up.
"All right, let me show you two around."
After hearing those words, Missy let out a sigh of relief. She really hadn't known what to say when she saw Edwin looking like he had a lot on his mind. Missy and Chase also stood up and followed Edwin to see the garden outside.
"Look,"
Edwin pointed to the horizon. It was already dusk. Chase looked at Missy.
"How about we stay here today?"
Missy nodded when she heard that, and they followed Edwin to his guest room, recalling everything that had happened today. Missy couldn't help but steal a glance at Chase. Chase felt her gaze and met her eyes, and she didn't expect to be caught. The next morning, Missy was surprised that Chase was no longer by her side. She got dressed and left the room. When she ran into Edwin, she couldn't help but ask, "Uncle Edwin, have you seen Chase?" When Uncle Edwin heard Chase's name, he was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled and said,
"I have. I sent him to go get water."
When she heard this, Missy was slightly stunned. Go get water? She had never heard of Chase being sent on a water errand, so it was hard for her to imagine. He woke up early this morning to get water? Edwin was surprised.
"Life here is a bit different. If you want water, you have to get up early and go get it yourself."
"I see." Missy understood. "But I never thought Chase would do such a thing." When Edwin heard Missy's words, the corner of his mouth couldn't help but curve into a smile. He said,
"Mr. Luther didn't come here to freeload." Missy found that comment funny. Edwin suddenly said to her, "When Mr. Luther was young, he liked to laugh, and it made everyone around him happy. However, after Mrs. Luther passed away, Mr. Luther never smiled like that again." Indeed, Chase now looked serious most of the time. Missy was well acquainted with it. "However, it's different now that Mr. Luther has you. I've seen him smile many times. That's enough to prove that you're his favorite person." Missy felt a little embarrassed, and her face turned slightly red. Uncle Edwin noticed Missy's silence and couldn't help but sigh because he thought of Kate, the woman who was like the wind. She was so gentle and kind, but in the end, she'd lost her life too early. As the two of them stood there in a daze, Chase returned with water. When he saw the two of them, he couldn't help but look at them with a profound gaze. He was wearing Edwin's work jacket, but it didn't look strange. Instead, it made Missy feel assured. It was dirty because of his hard labor, but it made him look manly. Missy stared at him, a bit intoxicated. Then she ran over and took a dry towel to wipe Edwin's forehead. Chase looked at Missy with a little smile. Missy noticed, and instantly felt that what Uncle Edwin had said was right. Chase would only smile so happily around her. "Are you tired?" "No," Chase said. "It's not bad to come here and get some exercise." Missy nodded. "That's true. Uncle Edwin just told me you have to earn your keep around here." Chase couldn't help but smile when he heard that. "I wasn't manly before, but now." Edwin smiled and interrupted them. Hey, what are you doing? The water tank isn't full yet. Hurry up. You eat breakfast after you finish." Chase and Missy answered, "Uncle Edwin, don't rush us. We don't know what we're doing." All right. Uncle Edwin looked at the two of them helplessly, but although he looked serious, he was happy. Edwin turned around, but as he walked, he noticed Missy was following him. He smiled. "What's wrong? Do you want to come with me?" Missy nodded. "Of course. I'll go with you to the fruit garden to pick fruit, right?" She was afraid that Edwin would reject her help, but then she thought of Chase's instructions, so she changed her approach. "Uncle Edwin, can I go look at the scenery there too?" Although Edwin didn't believe Missy's awkward words, he still agreed. "Come with me." He brought Missy to the fruit garden. When Missy saw the towering trees, she felt that her eyes had opened and she grinned. She followed behind Edwin and helped him pick fruits. Persimmon, dates, oranges. There were so many trees. This was really a legendary farm. Living in a place like this had to be a happy life. Uncle Edwin had made a good choice living out his old age here. "What do you like to eat?" Missy thought for a while. "Grapefruit?" Edwin heard Missy's words and laughed out loud. "Okay, I'll remember it." After they had finished plucking all the fruit, Chase and Missy were ready to leave. Uncle Edwin stood at the door and gave a lot of fruit. Seeing so much fruit, Missy looked at Edwin with some embarrassment. Because she said she'd like grapefruit, he gave them so many. In a few days, I'll send a plant to you, Mrs. Luther. You have to take good care of it for me. Missy looked at Edwin with some surprise. You're giving it to me? Thank you. Thank you so much. Uncle Edwin smiled. Come visit often. Yes. After Chase and Missy returned home, Hetty came over and said, Madam, someone sent a container of plants over. She was a little puzzled. Had Missy ordered them? Missy's face lit up, and she got up from the sofa. Where is it? Before Hetty could reply, Missy ran outside, remembering that Uncle Edwin had said he would give her plants. There was a car parked outside, and the gardener was moving the plants out of the car. Missy's eyes lit up. She had seen these plants before. She hadn't expected him to be so fast. She thought she would have to wait for a week. Missy's phone suddenly rang. It was Uncle Edwin calling. Did you receive the plants I sent you? Yes, I did. They're beautiful. I want to plant them in the yard. Edwin heard Missy's words and smiled kindly. Missy was really similar to Mrs. Luther. The two of them had a pleasant conversation before hanging up. By then, the plants were already in the house. Missy went over to take a look and was pleasantly surprised. There are daisies and osmanthus flowers. The plants were all wrapped in isolation film to ensure that water wouldn't leak out. Edwin had sent over a variety of flowers and plants, and the daisies looked cute with their white and yellow flowers. There was also a little sunflower. Missy's heart was about to melt. She ran to the front of the villa to clean up a small space. What are you doing? A man's mellow and touching voice suddenly came from behind her. Missy paused and looked up to see Chase's shadow. At that moment, Missy's hair was a little messy because she was working the dirt, but it didn't affect her appearance. Instead, she looked cute. His eyes bored into her. Uncle Edwin sent all these, so I need to plant them. If they don't get into the ground quickly, they'll wither. Missy didn't notice Chase's strange expression and turned around to dig in the soil. Chase watched her for a while and suddenly walked over and said in a deep voice, I'll help you. Chase silently picked up the shovel and began digging. Seeing that, Missy picked up some daisies to plant. The two of them divided up the tasks. And as the saying goes, many hands make light work. Half of the flowers were planted quickly. When Hetty came outside, she was surprised to see Chase squatting in the dirt and digging around. This was the first time she had seen such a thing. Hetty felt relieved. It seemed that Mrs. Luther really had a huge influence on him. In her heart, Chase was like her own child. Although he seemed cold, making it hard for others to get close to him, Hetty knew that Chase had a good heart. It was only because of his mother's death that it was buried. Now that Missy was here, Chase's closed-up heart was reopening. That made Hetty really happy. Missy looked at Chase and couldn't hold back her laughter. Your face is covered in mud. She was used to him being strict and title. Even though she'd seen him a bit messy before, it was amusing. Chase saw Missy laughing at him, so he stretched out his mud-covered hand and attacked her face. Very quickly, Missy's own face was smudged. Chase smirked in satisfaction. "Now you're a little cat." "Ew." Missy smiled and glared at him, and a small mud fight ensued. The entire afternoon passed by in the blink of an eye, and the two of them planted everything Uncle Edwin had sent over. Missy and Chase looked at each other and smiled as they surveyed at the fruits of their labor. The setting sun shone charmingly on the two of them. The flowers added a different kind of beauty to the moment. Missy was in a good mood as she clapped her hands and got up to walk into the house. She shouted, "Hattie, I'll cook tonight." As she finished speaking, she heard Chase say, "You're going to make a mud feast for me?" Hattie smiled so widely all her wrinkles showed. "You guys go on and clean up." "I'll take a shower first." Missy was like a child. She spoke quickly and ran toward the bathroom, looking at Chase proudly as if she was provoking him. Chase shook his head helplessly and smiled. Then he went into the room to change into clean clothes. After taking a bath, Missy felt her whole body relax. Taking advantage of the time Chase was cleaning up, she went into the kitchen to start cooking. She hummed a song while cooking. As expected, the night came, and Missy presented a spread of dishes. There was no light in the dark room, so Chase brought a few candles out of nowhere and lit them up. It was a candlelit dinner atmosphere. "You're quite romantic," Missy teased. With this kind of atmosphere, the two of them could only see each other's faces. Chase's handsome face was even more charming under the candlelight, and Missy couldn't help but hold her breath. When she turned her gaze and saw the red wine on the table, Missy exclaimed again, "You even got red wine?" This was as romantic as a date. Chase took out 2 tall glasses and passed one to Missy. His eyes were dark. "Cheers." The two of them clinked glasses and Missy drank it all in one gulp. She even poured herself another glass and muttered, "Drink up." Not long after, her face was bright red. Like a kitten, she nimbly climbed onto Chase's lap with her hands and feet, hooked her arms around his neck, and raised her head to kiss the man's lips in a daze. Chase put a hand on the back of Missy's head and kissed her back. The only things in the dark room were clothes scattered all over the floor and heavy panting. The next morning, the sunlight slipped through the window and shone on the person sleeping in the bed. Missy's eyelashes trembled. She turned over and stretched out her arm and found that the bed beside her was already cold. Her heart trembled, and her drowsy brain immediately woke up. The fog in her mind was lifting from what had happened yesterday. She couldn't remember clearly because she'd had a few drinks, but she vaguely remembered that she seemed to have kissed Chase. Missy's skin heated up, and her face instantly became as red as blood. In that case, was it her who took the initiative? It was over. Her image was completely ruined. Missy despaired. Fortunately, Chase wasn't around. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to show her face. Missy started to take a breath, but when she moved, she couldn't help but gasp. She was sore. It felt like she had been working out all night. It was clear that things had been intense between them. Missy was embarrassed almost to death. She endured her discomfort and got up to put on her clothes. As she finished changing, Hetty knocked on the door and walked in. She looked at Missy and smiled. "How did you sleep?" "Pretty well." Missy awkwardly nodded her head. It seemed like Hetty could see right through her. She wouldn't be able to face anyone in the future. Missy roared in her heart, but she pretended to be calm and asked, "Did Chase go to the office?" "Mr. Luther left early in the morning and asked me to make you a hearty breakfast." As Hetty spoke, she went to lift the blanket, but Missy's eyelids twitched, and she snatched the sheets and blankets from Hetty's hands. I will wash them myself." She ran out of the room as if someone was chasing her. How could she let Hetty wash this kind of thing? It had been Missy's first time, so it was inevitable that she would feel embarrassed. After putting the sheets into the washing machine, Missy stared blankly. The scene from the night before gradually became clear. She remembered that Chase was gentle to her, and even helped her take a bath afterward. Thinking of that, Missy's face was burning. Suddenly, an image flashed through her mind, so fast she almost didn't catch it. Missy frowned. She remembered that she'd seen a mark on Chase's lower back yesterday. Before she could think more about it, her phone suddenly rang, interrupting her thoughts. Missy's heart beat faster when she saw the name on the phone.
Are you up? Are you feeling okay?
Chase's mellow and pleasant voice came from the other side. He seemed to be in a good mood. Missy's face turned redder. I'm fine." Then she realized something and complained. "Why did you tell Hetty to wash the bed sheets?" After she woke up, Hetty came in and rushed toward the bed. Clearly it was Chase who instructed her. How could he do that? Hetty would know everything. Thinking of the look Hetty had given her, Missy wanted to dig a hole and bury herself in it. She really couldn't be seen by anyone. Chase, who was on the other side, was stunned for a moment, and then smiled lightly.
Sorry,
he teased.
I should have kept them.
You. Missy pouted as she stumped her feet at Chase's teasing, but her heart was filled with sweetness. She still found it unbelievable. Somehow, she really had become Chase's wife.
Remember to eat something, and just rest at home today.
Chase said thoughtfully. After washing the bed sheets, Missy felt a wave of tiredness. She didn't know if it was because of what had happened the night before, but she yawned and said to Hetty, "I'm going to take a nap." Missy slept for half the afternoon. When she woke up, her mind was refreshed and her body wasn't as sore as it had been when she'd woken up in the morning. She looked at the time and muttered, "It's only 3 o'clock. There were still 2 or 3 hours left before Chase got off work, and she was bored at home. She might as well go to work." Missy arrived at the office and noticed a discussion in the lobby. She could not help but raise her eyebrows. What was going on today? This was usually the quietest time in the office. After all, people were usually tired around 3 or 4 o'clock. But today, it was lively. People were lined up from the lobby to the lounge, and each of them held a piece of paper. A staff member in the lobby saw Missy coming over and greeted her with a smile. "Mrs. Danvers, you're here." When he saw a purple mark on Missy's collarbone, he smiled knowingly. No wonder she was only just arriving now. Everyone in the company knew Missy was Chase's wife and didn't find it strange that she was coming to work in the afternoon. It was Chase's company anyway, so Missy could come whenever she wanted. Missy heard someone call her and nodded with a smile. When she noticed the man's strange smile, she lowered her head and looked at herself. Her heart trembled. She was too careless. Now the entire company would know what had happened. She pretended to be calm and asked in puzzlement, "What's going on?" She hadn't been at work for a few days, and things seemed to have changed. If it weren't for all the familiar faces, Missy would have thought that she walked into the wrong place in a daze. The employee followed Missy's line of sight and looked over. He raised his eyebrows and explained carefully, "They're doing interviews, and Mr. Luther is conducting them personally." When Chase was mentioned, the employee's voice was filled with longing. Missy chuckled to herself. It seemed that he was a fan of Chase's. Interviews were handled by the personnel department and had nothing to do with her. So Missy walked to the elevator. But when she passed by the line for the interviews, she noticed a familiar face. That person was... Missy looked at the group of people waiting to interview and seemed to have found a familiar face. She walked closer to the interviewing crowd and saw a woman who looked quite similar to her college roommate, Alina, but she wasn't sure if it was her. So she shouted, "Alina?" The woman heard someone call her and turned around. Her eyes met Missy's, and Missy ran over and said to her, "Long time no see, Alina. I didn't expect to see you here." Alina felt that Missy was familiar, but she couldn't place her. "I'm sorry, do I?" Missy smiled and said, "I am Missy, your old roommate?" Alina finally remembered, and a smile spread across her face. Missy did not feel awkward at all. "I heard that you went overseas for grad school. When did you come back?" Alina said, "I just got back. Do you work here?" Like Missy, Alina was born into a working-class family. She was self-reliant and got into university by herself, and worked part-time to earn spending money, which reduced the burden on her family. While they'd been in college, Alina had spent most of her time by herself and never took the initiative to speak to other people. She seemed cold and aloof, but she had a good heart, and Missy had really wanted to befriend her. As the two were talking, Chase walked downstairs, and everyone saw him, including Missy and Alina. Chase spoke to the interviewees. "I'm glad you're all here. I'm Chase Luther, the CEO of this company, and I'll be conducting interviews myself." Everyone exclaimed when they heard that. They had never imagined that the CEO would be their interviewer. Chase frowned slightly, and the person hosting the interview said, "Everyone quiet down. The interviews will begin now." Chase walked to Missy and said with a smile, "Why did you come in?" He noticed Alina and asked, "Is this your friend?" "Yes, my college roommate," Missy answered. Chase looked at his watch. "I have to go start these interviews. Let's go home together tonight." Chase said that in front of so many people. Missy nodded shyly and blushed. Elena wasn't interested and silently read over the interview materials to prepare. Since Chase was gone and Alina was distracted, Missy decided to stop standing there awkwardly. So she went upstairs and sat at her desk to focus on her work. At that moment, Chase was interviewing a group of interviewees, but none of them appealed to him or had any insights into the company's development. Some of them were simply boasting without any substantial opinions. Chase looked at each interviewee's resume and finally saw Alina's information. Her achievements were impressive and caught Chase's interest, and she'd been Missy's roommate. But if she didn't have anything meaningful to contribute, she would still be useless. Even though she was Missy's friend, he would still treat her equally. After a while, Alina walked into the interview. During the process, Chase asked her a question.
Miss Garcia, if you were the sales director of this company, how would you promote our company's products?
Alina said unhurriedly, I wouldn't claim that our products are the best, but I would assure our customers that they can trust us to be safe and effective. If they didn't believe me, I would let them use our products for free. If they think it's good, they can order more. And if it's not good, we'll accept their criticisms. Chase hadn't expected Alina to say that, and he was more interested in hiring her. After Alina finished speaking, Chase let her go back and wait for further contact. The interviews that followed Alina's were the same as the ones who'd gone before. They were all just boasting, and their interviews were short. Chase stood up and walked out of the interview room. When he got back to his office, Missy had been working for a while. Her back was sore, so she stood up to stretch her body, and she saw Chase walking back in. Missy wanted to ask how the interviews had gone, so she followed him. Chase sat in his chair and was about to drink some water when Missy suddenly walked in. He smiled and asked,
What do you need?
Nothing. I was just coming to pamper you. But I didn't expect you to be so ungrateful. I'll leave then. Missy was joking, but Chase took it seriously. He quickly stood up and said,
My door is always open for you. You're my wife, and the whole company is yours.
Missy laughed. Okay, I'll stop teasing you. We can talk business. When Chase heard she wanted to talk about business, he became serious. You don't need to be so serious. I just wanted to know how the interviews went. Missy walked to the sofa and sat down, and Chase did the same. He shook his head and said,
Not great. Everyone just exaggerated their credentials, and not a single one of them could give substantial opinions.
Don't tell me you didn't choose anyone. Missy felt that it was a pity that Alina was not chosen. After all, she'd been her roommate for a year. Chase shook his head, stretched out a finger, and said,
I only chose one person.
Chase's criteria must have been strict. Missy asked, Who was that person? She was curious to know who would stand out among so many people. Chase smiled mysteriously.
It's a secret. You'll find out tomorrow.
Missy pouted and went to grab his jacket teasingly. He was really trying to keep her in suspense. Chase saw that her hands were about to grab him, so he didn't dodge. Just when Missy was about to touch him, he grabbed Missy's hand and pulled her into his embrace, bringing their lips together. Missy was curious about the new employee when she found out that Chase had a strict screening process and only selected one person. The next day, Missy came to the office early as usual, and there was still some time before work officially started. Missy walked a few steps to her desk and sat down. She arranged her coat and handbag and organized her paperwork before picking up her mug to get a cup of coffee. More people were starting to arrive, and everyone gathered in small groups to discuss something in low voices. Some people noticed Missy and nudged their companions. A few of them raised their heads and looked in Missy's direction. Then they lowered their heads and whispered. Missy narrowed her eyes and looked around. Although she didn't know what they were talking about, it was nothing more than gossip. Missy turned her head disapprovingly and carried her mug as she walked through the office. It was early in the morning, and there weren't many people in the break room. Only a few people were holding mugs and chatting. Missy smiled, but just as she was about to walk in, her coworker's conversation made her stop mid-step. "What do you guys think about this director?" a woman asked curiously without taking a sip from her cup. Obviously, she was just in the break room to gossip. She must have some serious connections. What else could it be? The other employee replied casually, but there was a look of disdain and jealousy on her face that couldn't be hidden. She just started and gets the title of sales director? She must be awful. I saw that she knows Miss Danvers, so she must have used that relationship. Missy couldn't help but frown when she heard that, and anger rushed into her heart. She now knew who the new employee was. Although she and Elena weren't close friends, they'd shared a room for more than a year, and she knew what kind of person Elena was. Missy couldn't tolerate people slandering her friend like that. So she walked into the break room and slammed her mug on the table. The sound of the glass and the marble hitting each other rang out. Missy raised her head and coldly looked at the people in the room without bothering to hide her anger. "Well, what kind of trash is she? How come I don't know? Why don't you guys tell me too?" The employees obviously hadn't expected to meet Missy in the break room, and their faces turned green. They lowered their heads and avoided looking at each other as they stuttered. No one dared to look up at Missy. "You had no problem talking a moment ago, so why don't you just say it to my face?" Missy looked at the cowering women. None of them dared to admit what they had just said. They only kept their heads down and looked at the ground. When they thought no one could hear them, they fought to out-talk each other. But now, none of them dared to make a sound. Missy picked up her cup and walked past them as if nothing had happened. She glanced at their name tags and made a note of them. "If you think you can do it, then go and be the sales director. If not, then shut up." Missy looked at the large open door of the break room and rose her voice. "Has everyone finished their work? Go and do what you need to do. Don't let me hear you talking like this again." Her clear voice rang out through the open door. The chattering outside quieted down, and the entire workplace fell silent. "We're sorry, we know, it won't happen again." The people in the break room nervously grabbed their things and hurried out, glancing at Missy, who was standing in front of them with an unfriendly expression. After apologizing, they rushed out. Seeing them leave, Missy's expression eased up. It was almost time for work. Missy quickly made herself a cup of instant coffee. She smelled the strong aroma of the coffee and nodded in satisfaction. As she turned around to return to her office, she saw Elena standing at the door of the break room. She didn't know how long she'd been standing there, but Elena's expression was as cold as usual. Missy didn't know if she had heard what the gossiping employees had just said, but she gave a kind smile and walked over, preparing to apologize. But before Missy could say anything, Elena took a step back with a cold expression. Missy was stunned. She stopped 2 steps away from Elena and looked at her helplessly. Elena's expression did not change at all. When Elena was notified she got the job, she was surprised by the position they'd given to her. Although she believed she was completely capable of being the sales director, no company ever gave a position like that to a new employee. And since she'd arrived that morning, she'd heard rumors about her using underhanded means to get the job. Elena thought about seeing Missy yesterday, and then she thought of Chase, who'd conducted her interview, and she felt uncomfortable. Elena didn't want charity from others. She wanted to use her own ability to get the position of sales director and not rely on her relationship with Missy. Thinking of that, the expression on Elena's face became even colder. "I don't need you to use your connections to get a job for me." Her words were strange to Missy.
Before today, she hadn't even known who the new employee who'd succeeded in the interview was. How could she say that she'd gotten her the job? Did Chase try to help her? Missy thought that it made a lot of sense. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that might have happened. Chase might have had good intentions, but this had created a barrier between her and Alina. Missy wanted to ask Chase about it, but Alina was still in front of her. Missy swallowed her explanation. She walked around Alina, and when she got beside her, Missy stopped. No matter what, you're now the sales director. Do you think you're not good enough? Missy didn't wait for Alina to reply and turned around to leave. After Missy and Alina separated, Missy walked upstairs to Chase's office. Alina's position should have been a thing worth celebrating. But with Alina's cold questioning and the gossip of the office, Missy started to feel that wasn't the case. Missy didn't know if she'd influenced Alina to become the sales director, but she knew that Alina had always been an outstanding worker, and she didn't need her help. Alina was proud, clear, and cold. If Chase had really recruited her into the company and given her the position of sales director because of Missy, not only would it not improve their relationship, but it would also make Alina feel disgusted. Thinking of that, Missy was a little anxious. At the door of Chase's office, Missy didn't knock, but pushed the door open and entered. Chase looked up sharply when he heard someone enter the office without knocking. When he saw that it was Missy, Chase's furrowed brows relaxed. He put his work down and put his hands on the desk, giving her a gentle smile. "Why did you come up?" "Are you?" Missy had been rushing, and now she couldn't catch her breath when she spoke. She took a sip of her coffee to give herself a moment to catch her breath. Then she looked up at Chase. Missy remembered Alina's cold gaze just now and was a little angry, so she asked him in a low voice, "Alina just started here, and you gave her the position of sales director? Why?" Before Chase could reply, she blurted out the next sentence. "Because of me?" Chase hadn't expected Missy to come to him because of that, and her two questions made him silent for a moment. He looked at Missy for a while, and then lowered his head to open the drawer at the bottom of the desk. He pulled a folder from the drawer. "What is this?" Chase didn't answer her question but started to do something else, so she was a little anxious. She didn't want things to have happened the way she feared. Then she wouldn't be able to face Alina. "Take a look yourself." Chase passed the folder to Missy and leaned back in his office chair. He had heard the rumors and knew that his decision may have seemed incomprehensible to some in the office, but he had his reasons. Alina's resume was in the folder, and Missy flipped through it. Alina's resume was beautiful. She'd graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Business School and gotten a master's degree in England, and she was a PhD graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. Outside of her degree, Alina's work experience was impressive. She had worked sales in a famous company and had outstanding performance. Missy was a little surprised. Although they shared a room for a year, Alina had been cold and solitary. She rarely participated in group activities in the dorm, and when she left the country, no one had even known where she went. After looking at the entire resume, Missy's anger gradually calmed down, replaced by embarrassment. She solemnly closed the folder and placed it on the desk in front of Chase. "Now you understand?" Chase looked at Missy, who was blushing because of embarrassment and couldn't help but laugh. "What are you laughing about?" Missy raised her hand and touched her nose. Her face turned redder because of Chase's laughter,
She felt ashamed. Chase looked tired from work, but even so, he didn't seem angry with her. She had misunderstood him, and without thinking, she'd run over to confront him. That made Missy feel sorry. Their eyes met, and Missy felt a warm feeling flowing through her heart. She was moved by Chase's tolerance and gentleness towards her. Chase looked at Missy and smiled helplessly. He stood up and smoothed the wrinkles on his suit jacket. Then he walked over to her. Missy just stood there without moving and raised her head to look at him. Her nose was a little red and she looked cute. "I'm sorry, I misunderstood you." She felt like she'd been stupid to question Chase without thinking. So she lowered her head and looked at the tip of her foot. Chase was stunned, but he quickly reacted. Missy was apologizing to him, and she was sorry for her impulsive actions earlier. Chase couldn't help but smile, and he rubbed the top of Missy's head. "Missy." Chase held Missy's chin with his hand and turned her head to look at him. "You never have to feel sorry for things like this. I'm happy that you asked me instead of just misunderstanding." "But..." Missy looked at Chase's serious eyes and couldn't say anything. So she finally smiled and rubbed her cheek against Chase's palm. "Thank you." Chase felt like his heart was about to melt. He pinched Missy's cheek and assured her, "I hired Elena to be the sales director because she is qualified. Just ignore the rumors." "Okay." Missy nodded, and they chatted for a while before she left. After returning to her office, Missy felt like a huge weight in her heart was lifted and she relaxed. Missy walked briskly to her desk. As she was about to sit down, she noticed a note on her desk. Who would give her a note? Missy picked it up and opened it. There was only one word: "Sorry." Missy smiled. She didn't know who had left her the note, but the one with the most motive was Elena. Missy thought of Elena's cold expression and looked at the apology on the note. The smile on Missy's face became even wider as she thought that the handwriting looked cute. Perhaps that woman wasn't as cold as she looked on the surface. After the misunderstanding was resolved, Missy and Chase's relationship also improved. Now, Missy could clearly feel the love and gentleness that Chase had for her, and Chase was satisfied with Missy's trust. Another weekend came, and Missy was exhausted from work. It was rare for her to be able to rest for a while, so she didn't want to go out at all. Chase looked at Missy lying motionlessly on the bed. He looked helpless, but his eyes were gentle. He walked to the front of the bed, covered Missy with the blanket, and asked in a low voice, "What do you want to eat for lunch?" "I'll go grocery shopping." Grocery shopping? When Missy heard those two words, most of her drowsiness was chased away. With misty eyes, she looked at Chase, her voice lazy. "Where is Hetty? Is she not here?" "Hetty took the day off, so I'll cook for you today." Chase was amused by Missy's sleepy face when she tried to open her eyes. He reached out and pushed the messy hair in front of her face away. "Then I'll go to the store with you. Wait for me." After Missy said that, she sat up from the bed to run to the bathroom without even putting on her slippers. "Put on your slippers. The floor is cold." Chase quickly grabbed Missy and put her slippers on for her. Then he relaxed and let her go wash up. When Missy finished getting dressed, it was already 9:30 in the morning. Chase got the car and drove toward the supermarket. Because it was a weekend, the supermarket was crowded with people shopping with their families. Missy liked to go to the supermarket with Chase. She enjoyed the warmth of doing homey things like shopping and choosing food together. She thought about the empty fridge and went toward the juice. Chase pushed the shopping cart and quietly followed her. He watched Missy carefully selecting items, and the expression on his face became gentle. The two of them finished getting most of their groceries, and then they headed to the vegetable area together. Because Chase and Missy rarely cooked by themselves, there wasn't much they knew how to make. But Chase thought of Missy, who'd been tired that morning, and had an idea. He picked up some meat and mushrooms that he'd never used before. Chase and Missy bought everything they wanted to buy in the supermarket. After paying, they rushed home. When they returned home, Chase turned to look at Missy. "You go and rest for a while. I'll cook, and I'll call you when I'm done." "I want to cook with you." Missy wasn't tired at the moment. She looked at the ingredients and knew that Chase was going to try to make something new. How could she miss that? Chase nodded in amusement. He took the lead and carried the food into the kitchen, and Missy followed him in. She stood at the entrance of the kitchen and watched Chase take out the kitchen utensils one by one. She couldn't help but feel a little eager. "Do you need my help?" Chase looked at the recipe on the tablet and then at the ingredients on the table. He seemed to be thinking about what he should ask Missy to do. "Wait a minute!" Before Chase could say anything, Missy suddenly remembered something. She ran out and came back with the yellow apron. It was the apron Hetty usually wore when she was there. Chase saw Missy standing there with the apron and he raised his eyebrows, fully prepared to resist. Missy noticed Chase's refusal and decided to use her big move. She skipped to Chase's side and shook his arm gently. With a voice like a spoiled child, she said, "Come on!" With Missy's spoiled attack, Chase was utterly defeated. He resigned himself to his fate and nodded, allowing Missy to put the small yellow flower apron on for him. Because she was much shorter than Chase, Missy had to stand on her tiptoes to put the apron around Chase's neck. Chase lowered his head and looked at Missy's face, which was getting closer and closer. The noon sunlight came in from the window and shone on Missy's face, brightening her expression. Chase felt as if he had been bewitched. He wanted to kiss her. Chase wrapped an arm around Missy's waist, pressing her against his body. He lowered his head and pressed his lips against Missy's. Missy's face turned red. At that moment, the phone suddenly rang, and Missy came to her senses. With a red face, she hurriedly pushed Chase away and half shyly and half angrily instructed him, "Hurry up and answer the phone." Chase lowered his head and looked at Missy in his arms. It felt like it hadn't been enough. However, the phone kept ringing. He could only let her go. "Hello?" Missy leaned against the counter and looked at Chase, who was answering the phone in the living room. She felt satisfied with her life and full of happiness, but Chase's expression wasn't as relaxed as before. His face quickly darkened, and his expression was full of displeasure. Missy didn't know what had happened. She saw that Chase was about to finish his call, so she walked to his side,
After a few minutes, the call was hung up. Missy asked him softly, "What's wrong? Who called?" "Vittorio." "Vittorio? What's the matter?" Missy was confused. Vittorio was Chase's grandfather's butler. Had something happened to Mr. Luther? "Vittorio said Grandpa wants us to get together." Chase frowned and didn't finish his words. Obviously, he didn't want to continue. Did he say why? "My father and stepmother are back." Chase remembered what Vittorio had called her over the phone, and his expression became even darker. In his heart, only his mother and Missy could be called Mrs. Luther. Other than that, no one else had the right. Thinking of that, Chase's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. Missy looked at Chase with heartache. She knew how important Chase's mother was to him, so she could understand his anger. Missy reached out one hand to hold Chase's tightly clenched hand, and her other hand gently patted Chase's back, comforting him. "If you don't want to see them, we won't go." Chase calmed down a little after Missy comforted him. He tossed the phone on the table and held Missy. Seeing Missy's worried expression, Chase gave a comforting smile. But then it turned sarcastic. He sneered at the phone on the table. "No, we have to go. Why not?" A cold light flashed in Chase's eyes. "We should give them a good welcome." Because of a phone call from Chase's grandfather, lunch was left unfinished. Ever since Chase had answered the phone, his face had been dark, and he didn't say anything. Missy understood. She knew that Chase was unhappy, so she didn't mention cooking. Missy called a nearby restaurant and ordered food. The two of them hadn't eaten since they woke up, and she was afraid that not eating for a long time would make Chase uncomfortable. By the time Chase and Missy finished their lunch, it was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Vittorio called again, saying that they should come over soon. Missy looked at Chase sitting on the sofa with a depressed aura and felt her heartache. She remembered what Mr. Luther had told her before. Chase's mother had passed away at such a young age. It was fine if he didn't have his father's love, but he had an unfriendly stepmother and a brother who came out of nowhere. That was a huge blow to the young Chase. Thinking of that, Missy couldn't speak on Chase's behalf and say that they'd be there soon. She looked at the silent Chase and made a casual excuse. Chase didn't want to visit. Other than his grandfather, he wasn't fond of anyone in his family. But he couldn't ignore his grandfather's request. Thinking of that, Chase stood up, only then noticing Missy on the other side of the sofa. Missy's expression was full of worry. She just watched him and didn't say anything to disturb him. Her understanding and tolerance made Chase's heavy and restless mood relax a lot. He undid his tie, and when he felt that he was no longer bound, he forced a relaxed smile. Chase stretched out his arms toward Missy with a rare fragile expression. "Come here and let me hug you." Missy felt like her heart was about to melt, and she reached out and wrapped her arms around Chase's neck, hugging him tightly. Missy was happy. After a short period of depression,
The real Chase had come back. Her Chase would never be defeated by something like this. Missy buried her face in Chase's shoulder and whispered into his ear. "Don't be afraid. I'll always be with you. I'll always be there." Missy's sudden words made Chase's unhappiness disappear. That was right. He still had Missy by his side. No matter what went wrong, he had nothing to worry about. Chase hugged Missy until Missy got a little embarrassed. Only then did Chase let go of her.
"Let's go visit Grandpa."
Chase's face was calm and fearless. A big smile appeared on Missy's face, and she stretched out her hand and held Chase's hand tightly. "Let's go." When Chase and Missy arrived at Senior Luther's house, everyone from the family was there. The elder Luther sat at the head of the dining table without any expression on his face. Jesse sat to the left, his own face expressionless. Beside him were Rosa and her son Lyle. The entire dining table was silent and awkward. When they saw Chase and Missy, none of them made a sound. Lyle had always respected Chase, but Chase seemed to not like him and always ignored him. However, Lyle wasn't just going to take that. He rolled his eyes, but then he saw Missy, whom he hadn't met yet. He stood up with a cheeky smile on his face. "This must be my new sister-in-law. How are you?" Lyle's indecent tone made Missy uncomfortable. So she subtly turned herself sideways and moved a little behind Chase. Lyle's actions made Chase unhappy, and his face quickly darkened. He stared at Lyle, and his words were a warning. "Watch yourself." "Hey, I'm just looking out for you." Before Lyle could say anything else, Rosa stood up with a smile on her face and acted as a peacemaker. She reached out a hand to Chase and Missy and greeted them warmly. "Come, Missy, Chase, come and sit. Dinner will be served soon." Chase's attention was originally on Lyle, but when Rosa spoke, Chase noticed her hypocritical concern and the smile on her face and felt a little nauseous. He pulled Missy over to the dining table with a sarcastic smile on his lips. "Do you think I need your concern?" Rosa almost lost the smile on her face when she heard Chase's words. She tried her best to maintain her kind expression and was about to say something when she was interrupted by Chase. "I don't eat with strangers, and you don't deserve to be here. Please leave." Jesse, who had been silent the whole time, could no longer hold himself back when he heard that. He suddenly stood up and pushed his chair behind him. The chair made a sharp sound when it rubbed against the floor, cutting through the last silence. "How dare you talk to your stepmother that way? Apologize." Jesse's face turned red with anger as he shouted loudly. "Apologize? Impossible. You should have expected this when you brought a stranger home." Chase was agitated. When he thought of his mother who had passed away in depression, the fury in his heart was more intense than it had ever been before. Missy stood beside Chase and noticed his red eyes and clenched his fist. She didn't know what to say, and at that moment, there was nothing she could say. she could only stand beside Chase.
What stranger? Hurry up and apologize. I wasted my time raising you.
Jesse saw the cold expression on Chase's face, and then he saw Missy standing next to him without moving. And his anger made him lose control. Jesse reached out and grabbed an empty glass to throw it at Chase. No one had expected Jesse to do such a thing. And Missy instinctively took a step forward in front of Chase, wanting to block the pain that was about to come for him.
Enough! All of you stop!
The elder Luther looked at the farce in front of him and slammed his wooden cane on the floor, producing a dull thud. His face was gloomy, and the noisy room immediately quieted down. Jesse didn't throw the glass. He fiercely placed it on the dining table and panted. Clearly, he was out of breath. Rosa stood quietly beside Jesse. She looked down at the floor, but it was obvious she was pleased.
Are you done?
Mr. Luther asked.
It's embarrassing for a family dinner to be like this.
Although the elder Luther was old, his eyes were still as sharp as an eagle's. He narrowed his eyes and swept his gaze across everyone. Finally, his gaze stopped on Jesse.
Will you throw cups if I don't stop you?
Dad! Jesse knew he was in the wrong, so he didn't say anything else.
And you jerk!
The elder Luther turned his eyes back to Chase and Missy. He looked at Missy, and his tone became gentler.
Is this how a father and son should talk?
Grandpa, you know I don't like family dinners, and I didn't want to come. Chase held Missy's hand and pulled her away, using his index finger and thumb to rub Missy's hand. Thinking of Missy's actions to protect him, he felt a warm current surge through his heart, and his emotions calmed down. Don't invite us in the future. I don't want to eat with people I hate.
Who do you hate? Do you think I want to see that nobody you married? She's never once been polite to me. You should have been divorced and found someone else by now.
Jesse had long disliked Missy, and he blurted all that out without thinking. Everyone in the room had different expressions. Chase frowned and turned around to look at Missy, not wanting her to be unhappy because of Jesse's words. However, Missy wasn't affected. It wasn't the first time he'd said he didn't like her. Missy patted Chase's back, indicating that she was fine. When Chase turned around, Missy gave a bright smile, as if someone had given her some good news. But her words showed no mercy. You don't need to see me, but Chase isn't someone who'll casually find someone else. Those words seemed fine. But to Jesse, who'd had an affair during his marriage, it was as if she'd spat in his face. He was so angry that his face turned purple, and his hand was trembling as he pointed at her. Rosa, who was standing beside him, also had an ugly expression. After all, everyone knew everything about the messy relationship she and Jesse had. Before they could say anything else, Chase and Missy left Mr. Luther's house. It was no longer a home to Chase, and if it wasn't for his grandfather, he wouldn't have come back. At that moment,
Lyle, who'd been ignored by everyone, had a meaningful look in his eyes as he watched Missy and Chase leave. He thought of Missy, who had a sharp tongue, and he showed some interest. After Chase and Missy left, the house's atmosphere was strange. Rosa glanced at her father-in-law and calmed herself. "Let's eat. There's no use standing around here." As she said that, Rosa put the plates and utensils on the table, and she gestured for everyone to sit down. While Rosa was putting food on everyone's plates, she quietly observed the elder Luther's expression. He seemed to be calm as she spoke in a casual manner. "Dad, is Chase under a lot of stress? Why was his temper so bad today? Wasn't he being too rude to his father? You're sitting right here and he's shouting and yelling. Why, it would be an embarrassment if anyone were around to." Lyle noticed his grandfather getting impatient and quickly interrupted his mother. "Mom, stop talking. Let's eat." He reached out, grabbed some meat and vegetables, and put them on his grandfather's plate. The elder Luther looked at the food and then looked up at Lyle. He nodded, but he felt more and more irritated. He had lived for so long, and he still had the ability to judge people. Lyle was definitely not as obedient as he appeared to be. The senior Luther felt deeply exhausted. At his age, he couldn't even manage to eat a decent meal with his family. Thinking of that, he felt that his appetite was gone. He placed his fork on his plate and cleared his throat. "I'm full. You guys can eat by yourselves." After saying that, the elder Luther had Vittorio help him up and went back to his room upstairs to rest, ignoring everyone who remained at the table. Rosa and Lyle maintained their hypocritical expressions as they watched the elder Luther leave. But once he was out of sight, the expressions on their faces immediately collapsed. "What's wrong with you? It was only us, and you didn't even mention that you wanted Lyle to join Luther Inc." Rosa looked at Jessie with an unhappy expression on her face. She was in a bad mood, and even her tone was rude. Jessie didn't know what to say, and in the end, he could only nod his head. "I'll find an opportunity to talk about it." Find an opportunity? What opportunity? Rosa stood up anxiously when she heard Jessie's words, her voice sharp. She put her hands on her hips and looked like a shrew. She started to shout, but because she was afraid that Mr. Luther would hear her, she had to lower her voice. "Now is the best opportunity. Dad is in his room now. Hurry up and tell him that I want Lyle to get a job at Luther Inc." Jesse looked at his wife and felt extremely tired, but he had no other choice. He nodded and stood up to walk to his father's room. When only Rosa and Lyle were left in the dining room, Rosa looked at Lyle with concern in her eyes. She waved him over, asking him to sit beside her. Lyle nodded obediently. When he sat down, Rosa held his hands with both her hands, and her eyes flashed with the scheming light. "Lyle, you have to be smart and perform well in front of your grandfather. You have to listen to me and beat Chase, and then Luther Inc. will be yours. Do you know that?" Rosa's voice wasn't loud, but Lyle could hear it clearly. He looked at his mother, lowered his head, and put on an obedient face. I know, Mom, don't worry. I know what I should do, and I'll definitely be stronger than Chase. After getting Lyle's promise, Rosa finally felt relieved. She looked at her father-in-law's study on the second floor from afar, and a vicious light flashed in her eyes. Chase had been in a bad mood since they left his grandfather's house. Although he didn't say anything, Missy could tell by his silence that something was wrong. Chase drove aimlessly without a destination. Because it was evening, there was a decent amount of cars on the road. Chase stepped on the accelerator, and the car went over 100 miles per hour, speeding around the slow flow of cars. Missy sat in the passenger seat with fear in her heart as she watched the stream of cars whistling past her. Red light! Chase, stop the car! They were about to hit the car in front of them, and Missy cried out involuntarily. A step away from the car in front of them, Chase stepped on the brakes. The car suddenly stopped with the ear-piercing sound of tires screeching. Missy was thrown forward by the inertia of the car and was pulled back to her seat by the seatbelt. She looked at the car in front of them and felt as if her heart was about to jump out of her chest. But at that moment, what worried her the most was Chase. Missy looked at the red light. There was still some time. She unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned over toward Chase. She reached out, forcing him to look at her, her eyes gentle. Chase, look at me. I'm worried about you. Chase met Missy's tender and loving eyes and felt that the tight string in his heart had been broken. He had a painful expression, and his eyes were filled with hatred. He held Missy tightly in his arms, murmuring in a low voice, They actually came back. How dare they? How dare they come back? Missy looked at the pained Chase and felt his uneasiness and hatred. She felt as if her heart had been pinched by something, and she was so sad that she couldn't breathe. She took a deep breath and hugged Chase, caressing his back. Don't be afraid. I'm here with you. Chase was about to say something when a honking sound woke him up. The light was already green, so he let go of Missy. He started to drive again, but he wasn't as tense as before. Missy put on her seatbelt and heaved a sigh of relief. Before she could do anything else, she heard Chase say, I need to take you someplace. After a while, Chase parked in front of a flower shop and got out of the car. Missy was a little puzzled, but she still got out of the car and followed Chase into the flower shop. When Missy went in, Chase was talking to the owner. Please give me a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Thank you. White chrysanthemums? Why did he want to buy white chrysanthemums? Quickly, Missy put things together and felt she knew where he was going to take her. When Chase and Missy finished buying flowers, the sky had already darkened. The orange sun hung on the horizon, ready to fall. Chase still didn't say anything but solemnly placed the white chrysanthemum on the back seat and then drove to a cemetery in the suburbs. When the car arrived at the cemetery, it was already dark. The gray sky covered the entire cemetery, and it was depressing. Chase took the bouquet of flowers from the back seat and hugged it in one arm. He held Missy's hand and walked towards the depths of the cemetery. When they'd walked for a while, Missy saw a tombstone surrounded by a white wooden fence in the distance. She held Chase's hand tightly and followed him without making a sound. When they got to the tomb, Chase let go of Missy's hand and looked at the photo on the tombstone. There was a trace of undetectable longing and weakness in his eyes. Missy followed his gaze and saw a beautiful woman. Her long hair was draped over her shoulders and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised. Her eyes were filled with gentleness. Below the picture was a line of words. Kate Luther, beloved wife and mother. A slight breeze blew over, and the leaves nearby made rustling sounds as they collided with each other. There was no one else in the cemetery at the moment. Chase looked at the picture of his mother and placed the bouquet of flowers in front of the tombstone. He knelt on the ground and gently touched the picture. "Mom, I'm here to see you." Missy knelt beside Chase. She didn't know how to comfort him at that moment, but she could feel his sadness. "Mom, this is Missy, my wife. I brought her here to meet you today." Chase looked at Missy, who was kneeling beside him. There was a slight change in his expression, and he said in a low voice, "Missy, this is my mother." Chase seemed to be immersed in his memory. He looked at the tombstone without any focus and talked about the past. "I grew up with my mother. She was really a good person, but..." As if recalling something unpleasant, Chase frowned, and a hint of pain appeared on his face. But quickly, his brows relaxed again, and his expression gradually flowed. "When I was young, I didn't like to eat, and she would always make delicious food for me. Whenever I ate one more bite, she would be happy. She also played the violin well. Every time I heard her play the piano, it made me want to learn. She used to take me to the attic to teach me, but I never paid attention. When I didn't want to sleep at night, she couldn't sleep well either. But she was never impatient. She always sang a lullaby for me, and she only went to sleep after I did." Chase talked about the past, and at that moment, he had completely relaxed. He thought of the warmth his mother had when she was still there, and felt as if he was still soaking in the warmth she had given him. Missy listened to him talk about things, and her heart ached. Chase had experienced such a painful thing at a young age, but he had never expressed his pain. He had persisted, keeping the warmth of the past in his memories. Hearing Chase's description, Missy seemed to really see those scenes, and she gave a gentle smile. Mrs. Luther must have been a gentle person, because only a gentle person could make someone feel love and tenderness, even though she was no longer by their side. Chase suddenly remembered something bad. He turned to Missy, who was looking at him with gentle eyes, and he had the courage to tell Missy everything. Although the past was painful, it was different now. He had Missy by his side, and he wouldn't be alone anymore. The past kept replaying in his mind. Chase felt as if his heart was being squeezed, making it hard to breathe. He looked at Missy and whispered to her in a low voice, "You know." Missy looked at Chase gently and silently gave him support. He continued without waiting for Missy to speak. "I thought my mom didn't know about Rosa. She just took care of her husband and son and gave everything for her family. The memory was too painful." Chase couldn't help but clench his hands into fists, and his eyes were misty. But how could a smart person like her not know anything? She actually knew everything, but she never talked about it. She was still as gentle as always, staying with me, making me food, and making me laugh. But I once heard her crying when I woke up in the middle of the night. She was crying, Missy. Chase's emotions had gone out of control. My mother went to Juilliard. She was well educated and wouldn't make a big fuss, so she would always bear with it. And the next day, she would appear in front of me as if nothing had happened. Later, Rosa came looking for her. When he mentioned Rosa, Chase's eyes flashed with ruthlessness, the disgust on his face obvious. She actually dared to come and find her. And the last straw that crushed my mother was Lyle. Chase continued to recall the past. Missy wanted to interrupt him, but she also understood that perhaps it would be better for him to get it all out. He was already 3 years old, and I was only 6. What do you think my father had been doing? My mother fell ill quickly. It was like her body could no longer handle it. I remember I wanted her to celebrate my birthday with me. She said she'd sleep for a while, and then we'd celebrate. But she never woke up again. The unbearable memories crushed Chase. His tightly clenched hands couldn't help but tremble, and he was tortured by the despair until his face was as white as paper. When he mentioned Jesse and Rosa, he felt like he wanted them to come to apologize to his mother. However, people like them didn't deserve to disturb her peace and quiet. Missy's heart felt like it was being stabbed by needles. She didn't want to see Chase tortured like this. So she stretched out her arm and wrapped it around Chase's neck and hugged him tightly to comfort him. "Please don't think about the past. It's all behind you, and I can't bear to see you so sad." Feeling Missy's warmth, Chase felt that the force that had been holding him up had disappeared. He reached out and hugged Missy tightly as tears flowed from his eyes. When Missy felt his tears on her neck, she panicked. She tried to look at Chase's face, wanting to see his expression. But Chase didn't want Missy to see him looking so fragile. He buried his face behind Missy's neck silently venting his emotions. Missy gently patted Chase's back, letting him hug her without saying a word. After a while, Chase calmed down a little. He was a little embarrassed, but he didn't show it on his face. He let go of Missy and looked back at the picture of Kate on the tombstone. Mom, don't worry. They won't get away with it. And with Missy around, I won't be alone. Missy blushed a little when she heard Chase's words, but she reached out and squeezed his fingers. Then she looked at Kate with a determined gaze. Mom, don't worry. I'll stay with Chase on your behalf. I will love him and take care of him so you can feel at ease. Missy's use of the word mom stunned Chase, and he clasped Missy's hand, unable to hide his strong affection for her. It was late, and the moon had appeared from behind the clouds. Chase and Missy exchanged a few more words with Kate in the cemetery before getting up and preparing to leave. The day had been complicated, and Chase and Missy didn't speak much on the way back. Instead, they quietly thought about their own issues. As they neared the house, Chase suddenly parked the car by the side of the road. The dim lights of the street lamp shone in, and Missy looked at the gloomy Chase under the dim lights. What's wrong? After hesitating for a while, Chase reached out his hand and turned Missy toward him, making them sit face to face. His eyes flashed with a bright light as he stared at Missy. Missy, I'm lucky I still have you. You've always had me. Missy playfully pinched Chase's arm with an indescribable sense of happiness in her heart. Today, Chase took her to see his mother. From now on, she would take care of Chase. Thinking of that, Missy couldn't help but laugh, and the smile on her face made Chase's heart itch. Let's go home. I'll cook tonight. I'll make what we didn't get to make for lunch. With Missy, Chase felt like life was already good for him. At least when he was having a difficult time, Missy was still by his side. Thinking about that, he couldn't help but give a gentle smile. Hearing Missy's words, he nodded at her. Okay, let's go home. Jesse felt that it wasn't a good night to talk about things, and he just had an argument with his son, Chase. Everyone was in a bad mood. However, his wife Rosa had urged him. Jesse sighed helplessly as he stood in front of his father's door for a while. He fixed his shirt, which was wrinkled because of the argument, and knocked on the door. Come in. The elder Luther's voice was full of energy, though it was muffled from the other side of the door. Jesse opened the door and walked in. His father sat at his desk and wrote with his back to Jesse, and didn't even raise his head when he heard Jesse's footsteps. Dad. Jesse didn't know what to say, but he remembered Rosa, who'd shouted at him downstairs with her hands on her hips. So he could only bite the bullet and take a step forward. Dad, I have something to discuss with you. What is it? Luther finished writing and turned to look at him. Look, Lyle isn't young anymore, and he's made some progress over the years. Shouldn't we let him... Jesse studied his father's expression and only continued when he saw that his father was still calm. It's time for him to work at Luther Inc. He can give Chase a hand. The elder Luther looked at his son and thought of his grandson who just left. A deep sense of helplessness filled his heart. I know. Arrange for him to start soon. Thank you, Dad. I'll set everything up. He couldn't hide the pleasant surprise on his face. He thought that this conversation wouldn't end well, but Jesse hadn't expected his father to agree so easily. He chatted with his father for a while, then turned around and left. When he heard the door close, Senior Luther's eyes became turbid. There was a medical report from a few days before on his table. The elder Luther lowered his head and looked at the medical report, and it seemed like he had aged all of a sudden. He reached out and rubbed his temples, his heart feeling weak. Forget it. Forget it.